Poland's history has been shaped by frequent conflicts with Russia. Russia has invaded Poland so many times that a mutual hostility is practically embedded in their genes. I had my hands shot through with an automatic rifle, and my comrade was struck on the head with such force that he completely lost his memory and couldn't remember a thing. We were also forced to manufacture coffins for Russian soldiers.
Oh gosh, have you made many of them?
Yes, the orders were massive. The guys could barely keep up. And they made these coffins out of wooden ammunition crates, originally used for Grad rockets. So over there, they have a completely zero-waste production cycle. I generally enjoy horror movies, but I have never witnessed anything like this in any film. I couldn't even fathom that human beings were capable of such actions. Most of the guards were pure sadists. It was evident from their behavior, as they seemed to project some kind of internal perversion.
Welcome. You're watching the True War Crime podcast, where I speak with Ukrainians who have survived Russian captivity. To give you some context, if we look at past global conflicts across different eras, statistically, only 5% to 15% of people who survived captivity are willing to share their stories publicly. It is always an incredibly traumatic episode in anyone's life. Therefore, what I am leading to is that we have highly exclusive content here, which will be deeply valuable for anyone genuinely interested not just in the daily timeline of the Russo-Ukrainian War, but in what actually goes on behind the closed doors of these prisons. And today, my guest is Tom Dychok, a former serviceman who was held captive by the Russians. He spent 3 years and 2 months there, if I am not mistaken. This is one of the longest periods among all the guys I have spoken with. But let us start a bit earlier, because I was looking over Tom's profile and noticed that prior to 2022, you lived and worked in Poland for a certain period, right?
I graduated from a military high school in Lviv, and it was right after graduation that I made the decision to pursue my university studies in Lublin, Poland. Initially, I studied full-time, but later I changed universities and transferred to a part-time program while working various jobs. In total, I lived there for 5 years. In principle, it was quite comfortable for me there. Of course, I like Poland very much. I have Polish roots and my sister lives there. But I clearly understood that I was still a guest and that my true home was in Ukraine. So, at the end of 2021, the moment came when I decided to return. Here, I had already found a job and started to gradually arrange my life, but then the full-scale invasion began. Unfortunately, I didn't manage to get everything done.
Did you volunteer for the war, or were you mobilized?
Volunteered, yes.
Why am I bringing up this episode involving Poland? Because in the Russian media, we very frequently encounter narratives claiming that the occupiers are fighting regular Polish troops in Ukraine. They claim that Ukrainians have already run out, so it is the Poles standing against them. What can you say about this?
To be honest, I didn't see a single Pole on the front line, although I fully understand that there are foreign volunteers in the ranks of the International Legion, including some from Poland. Even at the moment we were taken prisoner, the Russians were frantically searching for African Americans, foreign mercenaries, and so on. We simply didn't understand what they were talking about because we had never seen such people around us. Of course, foreign volunteers do exist, and they deserve great respect and honor for that, as it is true brotherly support for us.
Skipping ahead a bit, when you found yourself in captivity within those Russian prisons, did you speak about your Polish roots or the fact that you lived and worked in Poland, or did they try to extract those details themselves?
I tried my best to completely avoid any talk of Polish roots. Since they don't fully comprehend Western names, they viewed my name as just something unusual. They would say, well, that's what they call people over there, and you have these kinds of names. So I categorically avoided that topic to prevent bringing extra trouble upon myself. As for the fact that I lived and studied in Poland, yes, during interrogations it turned out that, besides my own words, they had retrieved enough information from the internet, particularly from my old Facebook page. They knew exactly that I had lived and studied there. There was even a moment during an interrogation when they asked me what the main facade of my university looked like and what monuments stood nearby. Those were the kinds of highly specific questions they were interested in.
And why, in your opinion, would it have negative consequences if you had disclosed information about Polish roots or connections to Poland?
To them, it could imply that I had allegedly come from Poland solely to fight as a foreign mercenary. They would cling to the narrative that I was concealing my nationality and had arrived at the front from abroad rather than being a Ukrainian. In their system, that carries severe criminal liability. The occupiers don't view this with genuine legal seriousness. Instead, they exploit such cases for propaganda and to create a media narrative, handing down massive prison sentences to people.
And what do you think is their actual attitude toward Poland?
Toward Poland, they have a purely negative attitude if you look at it superficially. But if you look a bit deeper, they kept repeating to me, Poland is already taking Lviv for itself. It's their city anyway. The Russians simply parasite on the slogans of radical fringe groups that exist everywhere. I generally respect nationalists because you can't have a healthy country without healthy patriotism, but the occupiers weaponize this for propaganda. As soon as we were captured, a Russian soldier heard that I was from Lviv and immediately started jeering, "The Poles have already taken your Lviv. It's over." I replied that I lived in Poland for 5 years, my brother-in-law is Polish, and no one there intends to take Lviv. So he just went silent.
All right. If we compare the intensity of the occupiers' hatred, who do they hate more, Ukrainians or Poles?
Without a doubt, Ukrainians. Right now, this is the hot phase of an open conflict.
Yes,
So
go
there is an
Ukraine!
aggressive, raw rage directed at us, a desire to destroy us completely. They are force-fed propaganda daily, telling them that we are unfaithful brothers and traitors. However, regarding Poland, over centuries of conflicts and Russia's predatory invasions of Polish lands, that hatred is practically hardwired into their genes. God forbid it should ever happen, but if an open conflict with Poland were to arise, their aggression toward the Poles could be even greater than toward Ukraine.
Just to close this opening block, you lived in Poland and you understand the Polish mindset. What message would you like to convey to them? Because I'm certain that a segment of the audience from that country will be watching our podcast. What would you tell them regarding Russia? After all, there are people there who might still view the Russian Federation positively or promote its interests, ignoring the threat.
First of all, I want to express my deepest gratitude to the Polish people. I have many acquaintances and friends there who are helping us immensely. As for Russia, people must finally realize, even if you do not feel the war directly right now and can afford to live peacefully or see something good in Russia, it is an illusion. If Ukraine, God forbid, falls, Poland will be next. We must stand together. Our difficult and tragic shared history must never be forgotten or twisted. But right now, it is critically important to think about the future, because we can only stop Russia if we stand together.
And what leads you to the conclusion that Poland would be next after Ukraine?
Because if Russia senses a lack of unity in the West, it will not stop after conquering Ukraine. It is an expansionist mindset. They always want to push further. First the Baltic states, Moldova, and then Poland as well.
Did you hear them say this themselves, or is this your analytical conclusion?
Yes, during interrogations, they repeatedly stated that they were ready to go all the way to Berlin, or they would threaten, if you don't surrender, we'll just partition Ukraine. So it is embedded at the level of their state ideology.
If you are watching this episode, please write a comment under the video, and even better, hit the bell icon, give it a like, and share it with your friends. Let us return to your direct story, as in every episode we focus on our guest's path. Could you please tell us how exactly you were taken prisoner and under what circumstances it occurred?
We were on a combat mission, a group of 5 soldiers, an engineering and sapper squad. Our task was to hold an observation post, relieve the guys who were there, and transmit information via radio. This was taking place in the Serebryansky forest in the Luhansk region. We reached the positions and split up. 3 soldiers stayed in one trench, and 2 were in the neighboring one. Suddenly, a heavy mortar barrage began. A hostile drone fixed our positions, and then the assault started. We were attacked by a group of about 20 to 30 occupiers. We held the defense until our very last bullet. One of our comrades in the neighboring trench was killed in action. Our escape route was completely cut off. We were surrounded. When our ammunition ran out, we made the decision to try and surrender, as there was no other choice. We began to come out. The Russians shouted, "Come out, we won't shoot!" But as soon as my comrade stood up, they immediately opened fire and wounded him. When we finally emerged, we were brutally interrogated on the spot, abused, and forced toward their rear. Along the way, unfortunately, they executed our wounded comrade, who was simply bleeding out and couldn't walk fast.
So they just executed him right there?
Yes, we tried to carry him on our backs, and I begged for permission to apply a dressing. I myself had been stabbed during the initial abuse on the spot, and I asked to take the bandage off my own wound to wrap his, but the guards categorically refused and simply liquidated him.
Let me clarify. A stab wound. Did you have a close quarters knife fight during the assault?
No, the knife wound was inflicted on me after we were detained, during the initial abuse on the spot.
So they tortured you with a knife?
Yes, they also shot through both of my hands at point-blank range with an automatic rifle, and they struck my comrade on the head with a rifle butt with such force that he instantly lost his memory and couldn't recall a thing. And they murdered our third comrade on the way to the rear.
Would you please state the exact date when this occurred?
It was December 5th, 2022.
So, by current timelines, that was the first year of the full-scale war. But the occupiers were already exhibiting vicious aggression because they realized that the easy blitzkrieg had failed.
They simply couldn't believe that the position was being held by only 5 people. When we came out of the trench, they shouted with rage, "Where are the rest of you?" I replied that there were 3 here and 2 over there. That was everyone. It was a complete shock to them.
So they thought a large unit was facing them, right? Because you fought back fiercely.
As long as we had ammunition, we kept firing. They suffered casualties from our resistance. The guys from our company tried to break through to help us, but due to the enemy's heavy artillery fire, they couldn't reach us.
Can I ask you to show your hands? I can see the scars from the wounds on both the left and right.
I was, you could say, very lucky that they shot at point-blank range. The bullets passed straight through the soft tissues, so the bones remained intact, and there are barely any serious scars.
How long did it take for your hands to heal after those shots?
About a month. The bones weren't damaged, so there were no complications. This shooting of limbs was purely a method of severe physical and psychological pressure.
Were they trying to immediately extract operational information from you?
Yes, they wanted to know positions, unit data, and they were also simply venting their rage on us.
How much time passed from the moment of your detention until you reached your first official prison?
It took roughly a month.
Did you spend this time in their medical facility?
Yes, first we were brought to a basement in the Kremina area, where we spent 2 days in a state of total uncertainty. The guards could walk in and start beating us at any second without any reason. The guys were beaten very severely. For some reason, they believed one of my comrades was an officer, so they tortured him with particular brutality, even though he was an ordinary soldier. After that basement, we were escorted to the Luhansk commandant's office, from where the 2 wounded, including myself, were transferred to a civilian hospital. Our third comrade remained there and was later sent to the Luhansk remand prison, SIZO. I spent 3 weeks in the hospital. The treatment there was entirely adequate. All necessary medical assistance was provided to us. Of course, there were occasional doctors who permitted themselves moral degradations and aggressive remarks, but overall they performed their work professionally. The biggest issue there was a severe shortage of food. It was chronically lacking.
After processing this stage with the hospital, you ended up directly in a penal colony. What did the intake procedure look like there?
After the hospital, I was returned to the Luhansk remand prison for another 2 weeks, where everything went smoothly. And only after that was a group of 14 wounded prisoners of war transferred to the town of Sverdlovsk in the Luhansk region, occupied territory of Ukraine. This is penal colony number 38. Surprisingly, there was no harsh intake process there. When we were led into the barracks, we were terrified because we thought we would be placed together with the Russian criminal underworld. But it turned out the colony was filled exclusively with our military personnel, mostly guys from Azovstal, so everything was completely fine.
By the way, most of the guys I have spoken with since their release mention that relations with ordinary inmates, convicts, in those prisons usually turned out much better than with the prison administration and the guards.
Yes, that's true. During the initial period of my stay in the Luhansk colony, there were still local inmates there who turned out to be highly patriotic and sincerely supported Ukraine. They would sometimes secretly say, "Slava Ukraini" to us, and try to speak in Ukrainian. Later, most of them were transferred elsewhere, leaving about 70 criminal prisoners, but we never had any conflicts with them. They openly said that holding prisoners of war under such harsh conditions was, at the very least, an absolute injustice. I didn't have close friendships with them, but we communicated normally, and not a single conflict ever arose.
Andriy Stratychuk mentioned in his interview that even criminal prisoners in Russian jails had significantly more rights than Ukrainian prisoners of war.
Yes, overall that is the case. The demands on us were much stricter, although in the Luhansk colony, the regime was kept within relative norms. However, constant searches, daily roll calls on the parade ground, and periodic prohibitions on wearing Ukrainian military uniforms caused serious discomfort. Sometimes they forced us to strip down when it was very cold in the rooms. Clothing was catastrophically lacking. What saved us was the opportunity to work in the industrial zone and earn cigarettes. As is well known, in prison, cigarettes are the primary hard currency. Even if you don't smoke at all, you can exchange or buy practically anything you want with them.
We all know this characteristic well from the cult film The Shawshank Redemption. It is truly a universal international feature of the prison world.
Yes, that's how it worked back then, and that's how it remains now.
And what specific types of work were there? What exactly did you do?
There was an opportunity to go work in the industrial zone, where they manufactured slag blocks and also made wooden coffins for deceased soldiers of the Russian army.
Oh gosh. Have you made many of them?
Yes, the orders from the Ministry of Defense were enormous. We had to work non-stop. The most appalling display of cynicism was that we had to make the coffins out of wooden crates that had originally been used to store ammunition for Grad, multiple launch rocket systems. They truly had a zero-waste production cycle. The rockets were fired at Ukraine, and the crates were reused to make coffins for Russian soldiers.
Just so the audience can better understand this terrible fact, Ukrainian prisoners of war in a Russian colony were manufacturing coffins for the occupiers with their own hands, using wooden packaging from Grad volley-fire rocket systems. And these orders were massive. What period was this?
This took place throughout 2023 to 2024.
Imagine if such order volumes existed back then. Now in 2025 to 2026, the number of liquidated Russians has grown multifold as the technological development of drones has significantly increased lethality on the battlefield. Right now, they probably have to work 3 shifts over there to secure the funeral logistics.
I think they have substantially expanded that production, especially since they brought in new batches of criminal prisoners, so they have plenty of labor. Besides the industrial zone, one could work in the kitchen, on internal domestic cleaning of the territory, or clearing snow in winter. Personally, I tried to avoid such forced labor, and many guys acted the same way out of principle, as it wasn't a question of critical survival for the unit. Of course, at work, time passes much faster, and you have the chance to earn some currency. But I felt relatively fine, and tried to sign up exclusively for internal duties, taking turns on watch, maintaining order directly in our living quarters. Though occasionally we had to go out for general work, when they applied the volunteer compulsory method.
If you were to rate the conditions in the Luhansk colony on a 10-point scale, where 10 is the worst option, what would you give it?
By the level of tension, I would give it a 3.
Understood. A 3 in terms of negativity, meaning staying there was entirely feasible. How much time did you spend
I
there?
stayed in that colony for nearly 2 years, until December 4th, 2024.
During those 2 years, was there at least some opportunity to contact your family, to let them know where you were and how you were doing?
No, there was no direct contact or phone calls whatsoever. However, there was an official opportunity to receive letters through the Red Cross. Over my entire time in captivity, I received only 2 letters. The first arrived precisely during my stay in the Luhansk colony in September 2023, though my mother had written it back on Easter in the spring.
So the letter traveled to you for almost half a year through all the checks and censorship?
Yes, I simply read the first lines where my mother wrote Christos Voskres and instantly realized the message had been traveling for 6 months. But for me, it was an incredible shock, bringing me to tears. I realized clearly that my parents finally knew I was alive, rather than missing in action. Psychologically, it gave a massive influx of strength.
Ruslan Odaisky told me in an interview that receiving a letter is a true event for the entire barracks or cell. Guys who received nothing could reread someone else's letter dozens of times imagining that those warm words were written by their own relatives. It is truly a priceless thing in captivity.
It is a massive emotional injection, even if only a few basic words are written. When you see and recognize your mother's handwriting, it is beyond words. For some of the guys, censorship even allowed family photographs through. I saw one fellow who carefully preserved and taped a small photograph of his wife and child near his sleeping spot. He looked at it every day. It kept people afloat, an incredible psychological anchor.
At the same time, it is vital to emphasize the stark difference. Russian prisoners of war held in camps on Ukrainian territory have regular official opportunities to make video calls and correspond unhindered with their relatives. This is a basic humanitarian standard that sharply distinguishes civilized Ukraine from medieval Russia. We understand this is an insidious enemy, but we adhere to international law. In Russia, the rights of prisoners are completely disregarded.
Because we are humans. No matter what battles are fought, no matter what strict conventions or rules are written on paper, the key task under any circumstances is to remain human without losing human dignity. It is absolutely right that Russian prisoners in Ukraine have humane conditions, communication, and letters. That is how a civilized system is supposed to operate.
Was psychological pressure exerted on you in the Luhansk colony? Did the occupiers employ ideological propaganda methods?
Propaganda was present there, but in very metered, minimal volumes. The administration occasionally brought in their printed newspapers and ideological magazines. I remember they had an ideological magazine called Rodina, where they constantly tried to draw pseudo-historical parallels between World War II and their current aggression against Ukraine. But there was no strict coercion to memorize this or take tests during that period.
Did they force you to sing Russian patriotic songs or their anthem in unison in that
No,
first
they
colony?
didn't force us to sing. Admittedly, every morning the Russian state anthem was broadcast through the camp loudspeakers, but there was no mandatory requirement to sing along. We just stood for roll call.
Wow, to be honest, this is practically the first time I've heard from guys who went through captivity a testimony that a Russian prison didn't require singing their anthem. At least in that specific location and at that time, it turned out to be an exception.
I didn't even know it or hear it at that point.
Skipping ahead a bit, I understand that at the next stages, you learned it.
Yes, later I learned it so well that I will probably remember it for the rest of my days.
All right, let's move on to the next significantly harsher stage of your story. After a relatively calm Luhansk region at the end of 2024, you were escorted directly into the Russian Federation, to the Republic of Bashkiria. Did you know at that time the reasons for this transfer, or was anything explained to you?
Certain rumors that our group was being prepared for transfer further out began to circulate through the colony back in October. Some assumed we might be taken to Belarus. Some hoped for better or worse prisons. When a large batch of guys was called with their things at the end of November, we were all sincerely happy for them, because we were certain it was the long-awaited exchange. We hugged, asking them to definitely contact our relatives after returning and let them know we were alive. We had a TV in our barracks that broadcast Russian news. Usually, when an official prisoner exchange occurs, the occupiers show it on the news literally within 2 days. We waited for the news broadcast with hope, looked. No mention of an exchange whatsoever. Another few days pass, silence again. Then we realized the guys had simply been taken to Russia, and shortly after, a new group of 39 men, including myself, was called to the central staff of the colony and announced that we were leaving for a new stage.
Forgive me, I will cut in with an important question before we break down the Bashkiria period in detail. Can you recall what was the hardest or worst thing for you during those 2 years you spent in the Luhansk colony?
In the Luhansk part, the hardest factor was the absolute informational uncertainty regarding the future and the oppressive feeling of abandonment. Especially when, at the end of 2023 and the beginning of 2024, a long period occurred when exchanges completely stopped for nearly half a year. You sit in a vacuum. You don't understand what is happening in the world, whether the fight continues, whether you are remembered at all, and how many years you'll have to spend here. It was a very heavy psychological pressure. Regarding the physical aspect, of course, in a confined space, minor domestic conflicts sometimes flared up between the guys from emotional exhaustion, but those are normal human moments that passed quickly. Severe systemic abuse or beatings by the camp administration did not happen to me during that period.
Understood. I asked this question specifically for contrast, as an entirely different reality begins next. So, Bashkiria, the territory of the RF. Let's start with the moment the convoy arrived and the intake procedure.
The intake procedure in Bashkiria, I don't even know what words to use to describe it in a literary way. As I said, I really love watching high-quality horror movies, but in no movie have I seen such a degree of beastly sadism. I simply couldn't imagine that living people were capable of behaving this way toward other humans. As soon as our convoy arrived by rail, we were instantly, with the use of brutal force, shoved out of the carriages and packed tightly into two prisoner transports, автозaks. The drive took literally about 5 minutes. The prison gates were right next to the tracks. The автозак pulled right up to the building's doors and the conveyor belt began. We had been given some dry rations for the road. We held them in our hands. They started driving us out of the vehicles with blows, shouting, "Forward, run, you scum." I ran into the hallway and heard just an unearthly, solid scream. Dozens of people around were simply howling from wild pain. The entire hallway was littered with our guys lying on the floor under batons. At that second, I didn't even understand where my things and dry ration went. From a heavy blow, everything just flew out of my hands and I fell onto the concrete. Already in the process of moving down the hallway, I grasped the reason for these terrible screams. The guards were massively using high-powered electroshock weapons. You are continuously beaten with electricity, hammered with hands, feet, and army batons. At the same time, their state anthem blares at full volume, and you are forced to sing it under blows. I knew literally two phrases that I randomly remembered, and I just shouted them in a circle without stopping to simulate singing. And next to me ran a fellow who didn't know the text of the Russian anthem at all, and they just beat him brutally for 5 minutes straight because of that.
So a person was brutally beaten just because he didn't know the words to the Russian anthem?
He was just mercilessly hammered, blow after blow, shock after shock. He tried to shout something, covered himself with his hands, but they kept beating him. After this first hellish hallway, you have to crawl forward on your knees and wait your turn. Their sorting system worked precisely. First, they shouted out the names of officers, sergeants, former ATO participants, volunteers, and soldiers of patriotic units from the lists. A so-called extended program of intake with special abuse was prepared for this category. Next, they went purely alphabetically. When I heard my last name, I had to stand up and run quickly to the end of the next hallway. Along the way, of course, they continue to knock you off your feet, hitting you with batons. You fall to your knees in front of the registration desk. I was struck by one surreal scene. I raise my head because the guard shouts, "Close your eyes," then, "Open your eyes." A civilian woman, a prison medical worker, sits at the desk. An absolute Middle Ages is happening around. The guards are massively beating people. I am being hammered with feet at this moment too, and she, in an absolutely calm, monotonous voice through this terrible din, shouts, "Name, last name, date of birth." You have to quickly provide all your personal data, information about chronic diseases or injuries while they beat you. After registration, they drag you further, where a large open cell was located. As it turned out later, the camp operatives had a note in my file that I was allegedly a hardcore Ukrainian Nazi. The occupiers found my old page in the blocked Russian social network vKontakte, which I hadn't logged into since probably 2016. And there, my adolescent patriotic photographs were preserved, as well as photos in the uniform of the Lviv Military Lyceum. For the Russian punitive system, a military uniform of a Ukrainian lyceum on a child is already proof of Nazism. Because of this mark, they staged a special, significantly longer torture program for me at intake. After the beating, we were all thrown naked into the shower room, literally throwing people onto the wet floor. There we had to crawl, wash off the blood, after which we were shoved into a permanent cell and ordered to quickly put on the camp uniform. But even after this, the acquaintance didn't end. Various groups of guards periodically entered the cell to conduct so-called educational talks.
They entered right into the cell, and by talks, I understand they meant another beating of the prisoners.
Yes, they enter, line everyone up, and start hammering with batons or shockers, venting their aggression.
How much time in total did this horror with the intake of the convoy last?
This entire initial process, from exiting the Afterzac to closing the cell, lasted roughly 2.5 hours. It was a solid, continuous shock.
How was your daily life arranged after that? What did the standard schedule look like in the Russian prison?
In the first few months, the daily schedule was brought to absolute automation. Wake up at 5 o'clock, and the first thing we do is sing the RF anthem in chorus. Then an obligatory intensive run in place began, physical exercise, breakfast, and making beds. After that, the hardest stage began. Throughout the entire day, we were categorically forbidden to sit on beds or even chairs. We had to just stand motionless in the middle of the cell on our feet for 16 hours a day, from wake up to lights out. It is worth noting that there were 4 camp guard shifts in the colony, which constantly rotated. There were relatively calm shifts, then we were simply ordered to stand quietly in place or allowed to sit at the table and read books. This was considered a great success. But there were 2 other shifts that turned the day into pure hell. They invented sophisticated physical abuse. They forced us to squat, do push-ups from the floor, or run in place for hours without a break. Sometimes, to diversify the abuse, the guard ordered us to sit at the table and play the children's game Ladushki for hours. We had to clap hands synchronously with each other, and the slightest mistake or pause was followed by a baton strike. They also practiced carousel abuse. The width of the cell was only 1.5 meters, and 3 or 4 men had to walk continuously for hours in a circle, one after another in a half-bent state.
And all this abuse happened purely by the guard's commands, do I understand correctly?
Exclusively by commands. In each cell, a CCTV camera was installed on the wall under the ceiling, an internal intercom connection with the operator was connected, and a powerful radio horn hung in the hallway, broadcasting orders to the entire floor. Commands were given every minute. Cell, toilet, intern. Cell, sit at the table, read. We were given collections of propaganda poems that we were required to memorize, 3 large poems.
Excuse me, who were the authors of these poems? Whose works were you forced to learn?
I won't even recall specific names now. These are some modern Russian authors who write low-grade propaganda after the events of 2014.
So these are purely modern propaganda texts, not Russian classical literature, not Pushkin or Tolstoy.
And thank God, with each month of freedom, I am successfully erasing this from my memory. It is not worth remembering. Besides poems, we were later allowed to read books from the camp library, exclusively works of Russian or Soviet authors with an ideological bent. We had to sit and demonstratively read them on camera. A separate ritual was the mass singing of the anthem. Before lunch, the guard turned on the loudspeaker, and we had to sing the Russian anthem roughly 8 times in a row. The number depended on the shift's mood. They could force us to sing 6 times, or 10 to 15 times in one approach. Before dinner, this ritual was repeated, another 8 times in a row on average, plus the mandatory performance once in the morning during wake-up and once in the evening before lights out.
I understand that in Bashkiria, you more than made up for the fact that in the Lugansk colony, you didn't sing their anthem at all.
Yes, that's for sure. Such a colossal number of times for one and the same musical composition I have probably never performed in my life. It lasted day after day, month after month, turning into continuous psychological terror.
I know stories from other released guys who said that usually in Russian prisons, the standard rule is to sing the anthem once in the morning at roll call. If the shift approved it, then the prisoners were no longer bothered about this. There were, of course, exceptions when the guards claimed that prisoners sang sluggishly or without respect, and then forced them to sing all day. But this happened as a punishment, and from your words, it turns out that performing the anthem 15 to 20 times a day was an absolutely regular daily routine for you.
Yes, in this particular Bashkiria prison, this was part of the mandatory, approved, standard daily schedule for all Ukrainian prisoners of war.
Did they logically argue such a wild demand in any way, explaining why you needed it?
No one argued anything. The guard's short answer? It is necessary. These are the rules. Execute. And that's it. We couldn't get used to it at first. Well, okay, we sang once. Why repeat it for hours? Of course, the first 3 to 4 days were hard for us, but under constant beatings you learn this text perfectly. I could sing it without a hitch from any verse or line if checked individually during interrogations. We wondered at this idiocy at first, and then just resigned ourselves. It's accepted there. It's part of their system of breaking the personality.
And the guards, the turnkeys, did you have the opportunity to see their faces, assess their appearance? Were they ethnic Bashkirs? They visually have Asian features, closer to Kazakhs. Or were they ordinary Slavs, Russians?
Personally, I saw them very rarely. First, I have very weak vision by nature, and my glasses were taken from me during the very first search, so at a distance of several meters, I see only blurry silhouettes. And second, according to the internal rules of the prison, when a guard approaches or enters the cell, we were required to instantly fall to our knees face into the floor, locking our hands behind our backs in the upper position of the candle. Looking at the staff was categorically forbidden under threat of immediate brutal beating. Eyes had to be always closed. When you were let out of the cell for interrogation or a walk down the hallway, a tight bag was obligatorily pulled over your head. Looking at them is a mortal danger. But at certain moments, when the bag shifted or during searches, guys with good vision managed to make out the convoy. They confirmed that most of the guards were indeed local ethnic Bashkirs, with characteristic Asian features. However, absolutely Slavic faces occurred among them. Moreover, by a specific accent and the use of Ukrainian colloquial words, we clearly understood that some were former citizens of Ukraine from the occupied territories of the Luhansk or Donetsk regions, who betrayed their oath and went to serve in the punitive organs of Russia.
So these were direct traitors from our side. Understood. I once decided to investigate the history of Bashkiria in more detail. If you look up historical chronicles of the 18th century, during the expansion of the Russian Empire to the east, Tsarist troops staged a terrible genocide there. Bashkir uprisings were drowned in blood, entire villages were burned, and the indigenous population was exterminated by the thousands, completely subjugating these tribes. And less than 300 years have passed, and the descendants of those tortured Bashkirs today serve this very same Russian Empire with special fanaticism and torture Ukrainians who are defending their freedom. This is some historical paradox and wildness.
They serve this empire like slaves and have completely lost historical memory. They don't reflect on the fact that they were once a separate free people with their own culture, religion, and tragic fate of subjugation. No, he may visually differ radically from a Russian, he may have his own language in daily life, but mentally he shouts, "I am Russian," and is fanatically proud of it.
True adepts and lackeys of the empire.
Exactly so, they are propaganda.
And did you feel any significant difference in mindset or attitude toward you between the convoy in the Luhansk colony and the staff in Bashkiria?
The difference was colossal, like two different planets. In Luhansk, the guards, despite being traitors, still remained products of our society. They could openly talk with us on some daily topics. Something of ours, Slavic, understandable, slipped through with them. And in Bashkiria, it is an absolutely alien, wild environment. You clearly realize that before you are representatives of a completely different culture, if it can be called a culture at all. These are people who will never understand you mentally. They completely lack empathy. Therefore, we quickly reach the conclusion, trying to prove anything to them, appealing to logic or human feelings, is a futile and dangerous thing to do. The only option to survive roll call is to answer clearly, loudly, according to the regulations. Yes, boss. No, boss. I hear you, boss. And not a single extra sound.
Did you experience serious difficulties due to the requirement to constantly communicate exclusively in Russian? After all, the guards probably immediately used force for any heard Ukrainian word.
I didn't have any particular problems with this. Back during my stay in the Luhansk colony, I was forced to read many Russian language books, since there were physically no others there. Moreover, among our captured guys, there were many from the eastern and southern regions of Ukraine who communicated in Russian in daily life, so I involuntarily pulled up my language level and adapted. However, overall control over the language in Bashkiria was total and extremely strict. God forbid the convoy overhears that you accidentally uttered some word in Ukrainian. It was punished by immediate, brutal beating of the entire cell. Therefore, when communicating with the staff, only Russian. We allowed ourselves our native Ukrainian only among ourselves, in a whisper, when we were sure the intercom was turned off and no one heard us.
We sorted out the 30 time singing of the national anthem. And did they force you to perform any other Russian songs besides the anthem?
Yes, of course. In each cell, a radio network speaker was installed above the door. It was turned on automatically at 5 o'clock during wake-up and turned off exactly at 21 o'clock during lights out. Musical accompaniment sounded continuously all day.
Meaning the radio worked without stopping, 16 hours a day?
Yes, the administration broadcasted a looped audio recording of the broadcast of some regional radio station. It seems it was Radio Kanty-Mansisk Yugra.
Meaning a live broadcast?
It was not a live broadcast, but exactly one and the same recorded block of programs that they replayed in a circle. In a few months, we already knew down to the second every advertisement, every news item or weather forecast by heart. Most of the broadcast consisted of their military and Soviet patriotic songs, Katyusha, Den Pobedi, etc. We were required to know their texts by heart. But besides the general radio background, each camp cell had its own individual, as they say, gimmicks, and specific songs that a particular shift of guards demanded to sing. For example, our cell fell under the distribution of a shift that forced us to sing in chorus Mikhail Krug's criminal underworld song Magadan Znachit Pora Domoy.
Meaning you were forced to sing classic Russian criminal prison underworld chanson.
Exactly so. Criminal lyrics about the zone. When the doors opened in the morning for the morning roll call, the guard walked in and shouted with a smile, "Cell, sing." And we had to sing loudly, with expression, about Magadan. Other cells had their own, even more absurd abuses. There was, for example, a neighboring cell that the convoy named Ninja Turtles. When they entered for the evening roll call and the command "roll call" sounded, each prisoner of war, instead of his real last name, had to loudly shout the name of some character from this cartoon. One fellow said he was assigned Krang. You shout your cartoon call sign, and then the whole cell has to chant a children's song in chorus. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Many cells had such humiliating nicknames and specific tasks that they had to perform on cue. They had another wild case. In one of the hallways sat our fellow, to whom the guards gave the nickname Troll. Every time the guard walked past the bars and shouted, "Troll," this prisoner was required to emit a loud, prolonged animal cry with all his might like this, "Ah!" And he had to shout like that without stopping all day.
Shout by command the entire day?
Yes, at first, when we heard this constant scream through the wall, we were sure the administration had simply turned on some terrible audio recording for psychological pressure on the floor. And then it happened that during another rotation, I ended up exactly in this cell, and I found myself next to this guy. I asked him why he was doing this. He explained with tears. If he refuses or falls silent for even an hour, they simply won't give him anything to eat at all. The convoy completely deprived him of his meager ration for disobedience. And in case of a direct refusal to comply with these idiotic orders, the procedure over there was as simple as possible. A group of special forces in masks entered the cell and quickly explained the rules of conduct.
Explained, I understand, with the help of heavy army boots, batons, and shockers.
Exactly so, shockers first of all. They derived great pleasure from this. During these roll calls and cartoon songs, the guards were extremely amused. They stood in the hallway, laughed, and filmed it on their mobile phones. At the same time, they completely didn't care who was in front of them. We had elderly people on our floor, men who were already over 50, and some even over 60 years old. They mocked them absolutely on par with the young. They beat them just as brutally, forced them to squat thousands of times, and execute all these humiliating commands. The occupiers laughed openly in the eyes of our grandfathers and said, "Grandpa, you won't get out of here alive. You'll die here." The guards felt absolute impunity and clear pleasure from someone else's pain. Do you think they committed these atrocities because they had a clear, strict order from above, from higher leadership? Or was this purely their personal sadistic initiative, a manifestation of their inner essence? Most of the staff over there were natural, convinced sadists. It was clearly visible that they were doing this on their own, of their own free will, deriving sincere pleasure from the process of torture. This is some deep mental perversion nurtured by their society. But, for the sake of fairness, it is worth noting that relatively normal people also occurred among them. When their shift took over duty, silence ensued in the prison for a day. No forced squats, no ninja turtles or screams. We were simply ordered to stand quietly or allowed to sit at the table and quietly read library books. Control on their part was minimal, purely within the regulations, so that their leadership wouldn't notice it on the cameras. During the duty of such calm shifts, the guards even secretly allowed some guys who smoked to take a few puffs into the exhaust hood. Of course, these normal guards were also limited by the strict system of the camp regime and couldn't allow themselves much, so as not to fall under a court-martial. But within their capabilities, they tried to treat us humanely and minimize violence. Such people were there too.
What percentage of the guards were considered normal?
I think significantly less than half, maybe 30%. Mostly these were young guys whose voices sounded around 18 to 20 years old.
Let's return to our rating scale. If you gave the Luhansk colony a 3 in terms of severity, how many points out of 10 will you give this Bashkir prison?
If 10 is an absolute, most terrible hell on earth, I will give Bashkiria a solid 9. I deliberately leave 1 point because I understand, in this huge punitive system of Russia, special camps with even more terrible conditions probably exist, where people are physically destroyed. But from what I had to experience personally, it was a real, concentrated hell.
What became the hardest trial for you during this time? Can you remember your harshest day in the Bashkir prison?
The most terrible stages were the intake procedure itself and the subsequent systematic interrogations. I was incredibly lucky in one thing. I never once ended up in the camp basement. The guys were taken there regularly, and completely unspeakable, terrible things happened there. I, thank God, avoided this. But my hardest day happened on September 16th, 2025, when I was led out for another major interrogation. The occupiers again pulled out printouts from my old Vkontakte page. They demanded that I sign a confession under torture that I was a professional foreign mercenary, a convinced nationalist, and coordinated some underground cells. They clung to my studies at the military lyceum. It was an incredibly difficult day, after which I couldn't recover psychologically for a very long time.
The extended version of this story is available on our Patreon. The link is in the video description. Follow it to watch the full story of Tom Dychok.